The splintered oak of the bedchamber door did little to muffle the sickening sound of Elara's fate being hammered out like scrap iron. She sat on the edge of a thin, mildewed straw mattress, her fingers clawing into the rough, undyed wool of her skirt until her knuckles became bone-white peaks in a landscape of gray poverty. Outside in the main room of the drafty, salt-licked cottage, matriarch Hestia's voice dropped like a wet stone, sharpening the terms of the transaction with a grating, rhythmic finality. The response was a laugh, a slick, oily sound belonging to Baron Silas that slid under the door crack like a venomous viper seeking warmth. Elara didn't need to see him to conjure the image of his soft, porcine face, or the way his small, hooded eyes likely glittered with the greasy pleasure of a new acquisition. She was that acquisition. A debt long-standing, interest-bloated, and unpayable. A legacy of failure passed down from a father whose face was a fading smudge in her memory. The village council, led by the iron-fisted Hestia, had decreed the sale necessary. The harvest had been a blackened rot, the royal tithes were screaming for blood, and Baron Silas, a man with a minor title but a legendary appetite for cruelty, had offered to wipe the village's ledgers clean. His price was the girl. A wife to warm his stagnant bed, a servant to bear his blackened name, and a trophy to display his supposed magnanimity. A cold dread, as familiar as her own shadow, coiled deep in Elara's belly. This was the crescendo of a lifetime of being overlooked, of being the curse child who lived on the frayed, shivering edges of the village, sustained only by scraps of grudging charity and her own jagged, stubborn refusal to break. She had been a ghost at their midwinter feasts, a hushed whisper in their Sunday gossip, a lingering problem they had finally calculated a solution for. The solution was to sell her flesh to pay for their grain. Her gaze drifted around the cramped room that had been her entire, suffocating world. The rough-hewn stone walls, the single sagging cot, and the small iron-bound chest that held her only earthly possessions. A moth-eaten shawl, a bone comb missing half its teeth, and a small, river-smoothed obsidian stone her mother had pressed into her palm before the wasting sickness took her. It was a pathetic hoard, a testament to a life lived in the margins of other people's stories. Yet it was hers, and they were reaching in to snatch even that. "She will be scrubbed and ready by the turning of the week," Matriarch Hestia announced, her voice rising to pierce through the wood of the door. "Cleaned, presentable, and silent. You will have no cause for complaint, my lord." "Oh, I'm quite certain I'll find a way to tame the little bird," Silas purred, and the oily implication in his tone made Elara's skin crawl with 1,000 invisible insects. He didn't see a woman. He saw a wild thing to be broken, a prize won through a ledger book rather than a heart. The thought of his damp hands on her skin was a violation that had already begun in the air between them. Something inside Elara, a small, diamond-hard kernel of defiance that had kept her sane through years of cold and hunger, finally cracked. It didn't shatter into dust. It split open like a seed, and a slow, white-hot anger began to uncoil within her chest, burning away the damp rot of her fear. They could sell her name. They could barter her womb. But they could not have her. Not the essential, untouchable part of her that still dreamt of starlight and the scent of crushed mountain pine. She would not be tamed. She would not be broken. She would run into the maw of the world before she let him touch her. The decision, once forged, felt like a physical weight lifting from her narrow shoulders. The dread didn't vanish, but it was joined by a sharp, electric current of purpose that tasted like ozone before a storm. She stood, her movements silent and practiced from a decade of trying to be invisible. She pulled the iron-bound chest from beneath the cot. Her hands did not tremble. They were steady, resolute, fueled by the cold fire in her blood. "If you're finding yourself rooting for Elara's escape," make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more dark fantasy tales where the prey becomes the predator. She changed into her sturdiest leather boots. The soles were worn thin as parchment, but they were better than nothing. She layered her spare tunic over the one she wore, creating a makeshift armor against the night's biting chill. Into a small linen sack she tucked the bone comb, the obsidian stone, and a half-loaf of stale, gray bread she had been hoarding. It wasn't much. It was everything she was. Outside, the voices faded as the men retreated into the night, their grim business concluded. She heard the heavy, mocking scrape of the iron bolt on the main door. She was a prisoner in her own home, locked in by the people she had called neighbors. The finality of the sound should have crushed her spirit, but instead it acted as the flint to her steel. A cage was only a cage if you accepted the validity of the bars. Her window was a mere slit in the stone, barely wide enough for her slender frame, overlooking the Blackwood, the sprawling, ancient forest that bordered the village like a dark, living wall. The woods were her only hope. They were deep, suffocatingly wild, and choked with legends of skin changers and lost souls, a place children were whipped for even mentioning. But tonight, the nameless terrors within the trees seemed far more merciful than the man who believed he now owned her soul. She waited. She listened to the settling groans of the cottage, the distant, mournful howl of a farm dog, and the sigh of the wind through the rotting thatch. She marked the passage of time by the slow, silver crawl of moonlight across the uneven floorboards. 1 hour. 2. The village slept, secure in its transactions and its petty certainties. It had forgotten about the quiet girl in the locked room. That was its fatal mistake. When the moon hung high and cold, casting the world in shades of mercury and ink, she moved. The window latch was stiff with rust and years of neglect. It protested with a sharp, metallic groan that sounded like a death knell in the profound silence. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but no sound came from the matriarch's quarters. With painstaking slowness, she worked the gap open just enough to squeeze through. The air that rushed in was sharp as a blade, smelling of damp earth, pine resin, and ancient secrets. It was the scent of a terrifying freedom. She wriggled through the opening, her clothes snagging on a jagged splinter of stone, the rough edge scraping a line of heat across her ribs. She didn't feel the pain. She dropped to the soft, mossy ground below, landing with a muffled thump that felt like the first beat of a new heart. For a heartbeat, she crouched in the shadow of her own misery, a fugitive from a life she had never asked for. She gave the cottage one last look, a place of meager comfort and immense, towering sorrow. There was nothing left for her there. No love, no warmth, no memories worth the breath to recount them. She turned her back on the village and slipped into the trees, a ghost leaving her own haunting behind. The Blackwood swallowed her whole. The dense, interlocking canopy of leaves blotted out the moon, plunging her into a disorienting, suffocating darkness. Branches like skeletal fingers clawed at her cheeks and snagged in her hair. The ground was a treacherous labyrinth of gnarled roots and slick stones. She stumbled often, catching herself on the rough, weeping bark of ancient oaks. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, each snap of a twig behind her sounding like the heavy footfall of a pursuer. Silas would send his hounds. Hestia would raise the hue and cry. They would not let their currency escape into the night. She had to keep moving, had to put a mountain's worth of distance between herself and the village before the sun painted the eastern sky and made her a target. She pushed deeper, guided only by a frantic instinct and the desperate, irrational hope that she was heading towards something other than a grave. After what felt like an eternity of running, her frantic pace faltered. Her lungs burned with the cold air, and her legs ached with a deep, trembling fatigue that threatened to buckle her knees. She leaned against the massive, moss-covered trunk of an elder oak, closing her eyes and trying to force the panic back down into her gut. The forest was no longer just a place of fear. It was quiet here, a deep, resonant, vibrating silence that was fundamentally different from the stifling quiet of her locked room. The air was cleaner, heavy with a strange, wild energy. The world felt larger, older, and infinitely more dangerous. It was then that she felt the shift. The atmosphere thickened, turning heavy as velvet. The hum of the night insects fell into a sudden, eerie silence. The whisper of the wind in the high leaves held its breath. It was the unnerving stillness that precedes a catastrophe, the feeling of being watched by something far older and more powerful than a village lord's hunting party. Her eyes snapped open, scanning the impenetrable gloom. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to breathe, to coalesce. She was not alone. The certainty of it was a cold fist clenching around her heart. It wasn't the clumsy, loud crashing of Silas's men. This was a presence, silent, absolute, and predatory. A figure detached itself from the shadow of a monolithic pine tree not 20 paces from her. He hadn't made a sound. He was simply there, as if he had been carved directly from the obsidian of the night. He was tall, impossibly so, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the forest. He was a silhouette of immense coiled power against the faint starlight. He was not a villager. He was not a hunter. He was something that belonged to the wild. Fear, sharp and primal, seized her. She took a trembling step back, her hand flying to the small sack at her waist, as if a bone comb and a river stone could offer protection against a god of the woods. He remained perfectly still, a predator allowing its prey the mercy of recognition. As her eyes adjusted to the silver dark, details began to bleed out of the gloom. He wore dark, practical leathers, but they were of a quality she had never seen. Supple, embossed with strange runes, and tailored to a physique that spoke of centuries of disciplined violence. There was no visible weapon, yet he radiated a danger more potent than any drawn blade. His face was a collection of sharp, aristocratic angles and harsh shadows, dominated by a strong, once scarred jaw and a stern mouth. But it was his eyes that held her. They possessed their own inner luminescence, a pale, stormy gray that sliced through the darkness like a lightning strike. His gaze was not lecherous like the Baron's, nor was it dismissive like the matriarch's. It was ancient, heavy, and terrifyingly intense. It swept over her, not with judgment, but with a startling, unnerving focus, as if he had been waiting for her in this specific clearing for a very long time. She felt seen, truly, fundamentally seen, for the first time in her existence. The sensation was so foreign it was agonizing. It was a gaze that stripped away the grime, the poverty, and the fear, looking directly at that defiant spark she had guarded in the dark. He took a single, deliberate step forward, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A strange, inexplicable pull resonated from the center of her chest, a low, visceral thrum that echoed the silent power emanating from him. It was a physical tether, a thread suddenly pulled taut between their souls. It wasn't frightening. Inexplicably, it felt like recognition, like coming home to a castle she had only ever seen in fever dreams. Her heart, which had been hammering in a panic, gave a painful, convulsive lurch and began to beat to a new, deeper rhythm. A drumbeat for a war she hadn't known she was fighting. He stopped, sensing the profound effect his presence had on her. He stood there, a pillar of shadow in the whispering woods, his stormy eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and a tension that was more than just fear. It was destiny, coiled and ready to strike. If you want to see the concept art for this mysterious forest king, check out the link in the description below. Finally, his voice came. It was the night given form, deep, resonant, and calm, with an undercurrent of iron that suggested it was a voice accustomed to the absolute obedience of thousands. "Where are you going, little bird?" The question was simple, direct. It should have been easy to lie, to feign the role of a lost, simple girl. But looking into those eyes, she knew a lie would be a pathetic insult, and for some reason she could not bring herself to be small in front of him. Thinking him a bounty hunter, perhaps one more skilled and lethal than any Silas could afford, she found that her defiance was the only currency she had left. She lifted her chin, her own voice barely a whisper, is but laced with the same stubbornness that had carried her through the window. Anywhere but back there. I would rather the wolves have me than the Baron. A flicker of something, surprise or perhaps a dark interest, crossed his stoic features. It was there and gone in a heartbeat. He took another slow step closer, the pull in her chest intensifying until it was difficult to draw breath. He was close enough now that she could see the faint silver threads at his temples and the hard, uncompromising line of his mouth. He smelled of wood smoke, ozone, and something uniquely his, power. "They will come for you," he stated. It wasn't a warning. It was a cold, hard fact of the world. "Let them," she shot back, the words far braver than the trembling of her knees. "I will not be a piece of property on a ledger. I will die before I go back to that cage." A long moment passed as he studied her, his gaze unwavering. She felt like a page in an ancient book he was reading with intense, scholarly concentration. He was weighing her, measuring the truth of her soul against the frailty of her body. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, but no less commanding. "Elara," she said. It was the first time her name felt like it belonged to her, and not to the village's debt. It was the name of a girl who had survived the Blackwood at midnight. "Elara," he repeated. The way he said it was different. He didn't speak it as a label. He spoke it as a discovery, a word of profound, cosmic significance. The thread between them vibrated. A chord had been struck in the heart of the world. I am Malakor. The name meant nothing to her, yet it felt like it should have been written in the stars. He was a stranger, a formidable and terrifying presence, and yet that inexplicable sense of safety warred with her instinct to flee. He was the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered, and also the only refuge she could see in a world of shadows. "They will not have you," Malakor said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl that sent a delicious, terrifying shiver down her spine. It wasn't the predatory tone of Silas. This was the sound of a mountain declaring it would not be moved by the wind. "You are coming with me." The command was absolute. It was a royal decree, though she did not yet know the crown he wore. To her, it was a terrifying, impossible choice. To trust this shadow man was madness. To refuse was to be left to the mercy of the hounds. "Why?" The word was torn from her, raw with suspicion. "You don't know me. You don't know what I am, or why they want me." "I know enough," he said, his gray eyes searching her face with a hunger that wasn't for her flesh, but for her spirit. "I know you have a fire in you that refuses to be quenched by the rain, and I know that you were never meant for the likes of them." He took the final step, closing the distance between them. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a physical force, a wall of heat and crushing strength that shielded her from the cold night. "I will not force you, Elara. The choice is yours. You can keep running. You can take your chances with the elements and the beasts. I will not stop you." He paused, letting the weight of that grim reality settle. "Or," he continued, his voice a low murmur that seemed to speak directly to the vibrating thread in her chest, "you can come with me, and I swear on my blood and my name, no one will ever treat you as property again. You will walk as a wolf, not a lamb." In that moment he offered her more than just a hiding place. He offered her dignity. He saw the very thing she was fighting for, and named it as a right she deserved. In his eyes, she wasn't a debt. She was a person with a fire inside. As he looked at her, his gaze turned inward for a fleeting second, revealing something genuine and deeply hidden. For a long, long time, he had been navigating a sea of loneliness. She recognized it instantly. It was the same hollow ache she had lived with her entire life. This powerful, terrifying man was as isolated as the orphan girl he had found. The realization was a staggering blow, dismantling the last of her defenses. Her fear didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by the undeniable pull of destiny. She looked from his intense eyes to the dark, unwelcoming forest behind her, and then back to the man who looked like the end of the world. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll come with you, Malakor." The relief that washed over his features was subtle. A slight softening of his mouth, a lessening of the lethal tension in his shoulders. But she saw it. It was as if the world had finally righted itself for him. He offered her his hand. His fingers were long and calloused, his palm wide and warm. When she placed her small, trembling hand in his, a jolt like liquid lightning shot up her arm. It wasn't a shock of pain, but of completion. He curled his fingers around hers, and his grip firm, protective, and eternal. "Good," was all he said. He turned and began to walk, leading her deeper into the heart of the Blackwood, away from her past, and into a future she couldn't yet imagine. With his hand in hers, she didn't stumble. She felt anchored, secure, as if she could walk through the mouth of hell itself and fear nothing. They walked for hours in a comfortable, heavy silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but filled with the low-frequency hum of their new connection. As the first hint of a bruised dawn began to bleed through the canopy, they arrived at a hidden clearing. 2 massive charcoal-black horses stood tethered there, their coats gleaming like polished obsidian. They were war-bred monsters, Elara realized with a jolt, larger and more magnificent than any beast in the village. A small, well-supplied camp was set up nearby, a testament to his preparedness. He had not stumbled upon her by chance. He had been waiting for this exact moment. The thought sent a fresh wave of confusion through her, but before she could speak, he released her hand to tend to the horses. The loss of contact left her feeling suddenly cold and untethered. He worked with an efficient, lethal economy of motion, checking leather straps and offering the beasts water. He moved like a commander of legions. He turned back to her, holding out a silver-capped waterskin and a piece of dried venison. "Eat," he commanded gently. "We have a long ride ahead to the high citadel." She ate, her hunger a dull ache she had long grown used to. The food was rich, and the water was cold and clean. As she ate, she watched him, trying to piece together the enigma. He was no mere bounty hunter or mercenary. The authority he wore wasn't a uniform. It was woven into his very marrow. It was innate. The journey that followed was a blur of motion and shifting landscapes. He lifted her onto one of the massive horses, as if she weighed no more than a feather, mounting behind her. His body was a solid wall of heat at her back, his arms a protective cage around her as he took the reins. The intimacy of it should have terrified her, but it felt strangely natural, as if she had been carved to fit against him. They rode hard, leaving her old life farther behind with every powerful stride. They stopped only when necessary, at quiet, fortified inns on the fringes of the borderlands, where Malakor's commanding presence ensured they were given the best quarters without a single question, and he never let her out of his sight. He would stand guard outside her door while she washed and take the floor by the entrance when they shared a room, a silent, watchful sentinel. He spoke little, but his actions were a symphony of respect. He ensured she ate first, that she was warm, and that the world stayed at a distance. Slowly, the fear receded, replaced by a blossoming curiosity and the steady, warm glow of the bond between them. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression of such raw, starving tenderness, it stole her breath. Their fragile peace was shattered 3 days later. They had stopped at a larger town, a bustling trade hub, to resupply. They were in the common room of a sprawling, stone-built inn, Malakor having secured a table in a secluded, dark corner. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors burst open with a crash that silenced the room. Baron Silas strode in, flanked by 4 brutish, armored guards and a triumphant-looking matriarch Hestia. The Baron's face was a mask of purple fury, his small eyes locking onto Elara with venomous satisfaction. "There she is," he bellowed, pointing a thick, trembling finger. The entire room fell into a deathly silence. The runaway property. My property. Elara's blood turned to ice. The fragile sense of safety she had built crumbled into ash. She felt the familiar shame wash over her, a tide of filth that threatened to drown the woman she was becoming. Silas swaggered toward them, his arrogance bolstered by his men. "I don't know who you are, stranger," he sneered at Malakor, "but you are in possession of something that belongs to me. A debt was paid. A contract was sealed. The girl comes with me, or my men will paint this floor with your blood." Malakor did not move. He sat perfectly still, his body relaxed in a way that was far more terrifying than a drawn sword. But Elara, pressed against his side, could feel the sudden, lethal tension coiling in his muscles. His face was a mask of calm, but his gray eyes had turned to shards of frozen glass. Matriarch Hestia stepped forward, her expression pinched with self-righteous malice. She saw Malakor's fine leathers and assumed him to be a wealthy mercenary who had been tricked. She sought to destroy Elara's value entirely. "Do not be fooled by her, sir," the matriarch said, her voice dripping with false piety. "She is nothing, an orphan from a disgraced, bankrupt line. She is worthless, a burden the village has carried out of pity. Her debt is her only value. She is nothing but a bargaining chip, and you have stolen her." The words were knives, twisting into Elara's oldest wounds. Worthless, burden, bargaining chip. It was everything she had ever feared she was. The shame was a physical blow, and she flinched, curling into herself, wishing for the darkness to take her. All the dignity Malakor had given her felt like a temporary mask. Silas, emboldened by Malakor's silence, reached out to grab her arm. "Come, you little stray. Your games are over." Before his fingers could make contact, Malakor moved. It wasn't a strike. It was an eclipse. He raised his hand, simply placing it in the air between the Baron and Elara. His other arm tightened around her, pulling her securely against his side, a barrier of solid muscle and unyielding will. He rose to his feet, and his full height seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. He towered over the Baron, his shadow falling over the smaller man like a shroud. The calm authority he had carried before now blazed into a cold, controlled fury that was terrifying to behold. The very air began to vibrate with a power that had every patron in the inn shrinking back. "You will not touch her," Malakor said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the room like a razor. It was the voice of a man who never had to raise it, for his softest word was the final law of the land. Silas, too arrogant to recognize the scent of death, scoffed. "And who are you to tell me what I can do? She is mine by the law of the council." Malakor's gaze was utterly chilling. He slowly held up his left hand, and turning it slightly so the firelight caught the heavy gold ring on his finger. It was embossed with a seal Elara didn't recognize, but the rest of the room did. The howling wolf of the Shadow Throne. The signet of the High King. A collective, terrified gasp swept through the room. A grizzled former soldier in the corner dropped his mug and fell instantly to his knees, his forehead hitting the floor. Others followed in a wave of clattering chairs and hushed prayers. In seconds, the entire common room was kneeling. Silas stared at the ring, his face draining of all color until he looked like a corpse. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. Hestia looked as though she had been turned to stone by a Medusa. They hadn't just accosted a stranger, they had challenged the High King Malakor, or the Wolf of the North, a ruler whose name was synonymous with absolute power and ruthless justice. Malakor's icy gaze shifted to Silas. "Her debt?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. He reached into a pouch and tossed a single, heavy gold coin onto the table. It spun, flashing brilliantly before settling. It was more money than the entire village would see in a century. Consider it paid in full, along with the interest of your insolence. He then looked down at Elara. The fury in his eyes vanished, replaced by that breathtaking tenderness. Your past is ash, he murmured, his voice for her alone. It means nothing to me. Your village, their debts, their petty laws, they are nothing but dust under my boots. He gently brushed a tear from her cheek. You are what matters. You are the only thing that has mattered to me in 100 years. The words were a healing balm on a lifetime of scars. Elara felt the weight of her shame simply evaporate. He saw past the orphan and the debt, and saw only her. His attention returned to the terrified figures before him. As for you, Silas, he said, his tone flat and final, you will never hold title or land in my kingdom again. Your name is struck from the rolls. Be grateful I allow you to keep the life you value so much. Now, crawl out of my sight. Silas, trembling so hard he could barely stand, scrambled backward and fled the inn. Malakor then looked at Hestia. Your village's charter is now under royal review. I suggest you return and teach your people the difference between law and justice, for my magistrates will be arriving to ensure the lesson is learned. With a final, dismissive glance, he turned his back on them. He cupped Elara's face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the last of her tears. You are mine now, he breathed, the words a sacred, unbreakable vow. And for the first time in her life, the idea of belonging to someone didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a shield. It felt like home. 3 months later, Elara woke to the soft morning light streaming through the towering, arched windows of the royal bedchamber in the high citadel. The linens were the finest silk, the air was scented with lavender and mountain air, and the man beside her was still sleeping. His powerful form relaxed in a way he only allowed when he was with her. Queen Elara, his Elara, traced the line of his jaw with a gentle finger. A simple act of intimacy that still filled her with a sense of wonder. The orphan girl from the Blackwood was now the heart of the kingdom. It felt like a dream, but the steady, heavy beat of his heart against her palm was the most real thing she had ever known. Their life together was not a fairy tale of idleness. Malakor had seen the fire in her, and he hadn't sought to extinguish it. He had fanned it into a brilliant, guiding flame. Her past, once a source of crushing shame, had become her greatest weapon. With Malakor's full support and the limitless resources of the Shadow Throne, she had established the Obsidian Foundation, a royal initiative dedicated to breaking generational debt and providing sanctuary to orphans across the continent. Her days were filled with fierce purpose. She met with ministers, reviewed petitions, and traveled to the very corners of the realm, bringing not just charity, but ironclad justice. She was no longer a bargaining chip. She was a sovereign. Her counsel was valued, and her compassion was a force that was reshaping the kingdom from the inside out. She had found her voice, and it was a voice that spoke for the voiceless. Malakor's eyes fluttered open, his stormy gray gaze finding hers instantly. A slow, warm smile spread across his lips, a sight reserved exclusively for her. "Good morning, my heart," he murmured, pulling her down for a lingering kiss that tasted of forever. "What grand plans does my queen have to change the world today?" "Today," she said, snuggling into the warmth of his chest, "I am meeting with the guilds to ensure every child in the city has a path to a trade. And then we have the land reform hearings." He listened, his expression radiating a pride so fierce it warmed her better than the sun. "Ambitious," he noted, "and necessary." He fell silent for a moment, his hand stroking her hair. He then grew serious. "Are you truly happy, Elara?" The question was simple, but it held the weight of his deepest concern. He had given her everything, but he knew that titles were not the things that healed a soul. She thought of the cold, hungry nights and the girl she used to be, the one who thought survival was the only goal. that girl was gone. "Malakor," she said softly, looking into the eyes that had seen her in the dark. "My life began the night I fled into the forest. You were waiting for me beyond the trees. I am not just happy, I am whole." A profound contentment settled over his features. He pulled her tighter, his hold a perfect, unbreakable circle of safety. "And so," he whispered against her hair, his voice a rumbling, eternal vow, "did mine." If you enjoyed this journey from the shadows to the throne, don't forget to like, comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe for more epic tales of dark romance and redemption.